silence is the first thing you have to understand. It's not just an absence of noise, a simple pause between sounds. No, this is something heavier. It's a presence, a physical weight that presses in on your eardrums, that smothers the memory of sound beneath a thick, suffocating blanket. It's been 3 days since I last heard the human voice. A bird's song from the linden tree in the churchyard. Even the distant rumble of a car on the cobblestones outside. 3 days since God cleared his throat and the world went quiet. My name is Marcus, and for 40 years I was a priest. I'm 62 now, and my hands, the ones that blessed the sick and offered up the body of Christ, have a tremor I can't seem to control. They shake as I polish the silver chalice, my reflection wavering in its gleaming surface. A tired old man with hollow eyes and a collar that feels more like a noose with each passing hour. I still do the work. I have to. Habit is a fortress in a world without ramparts. I sweep the nave, the rhythmic whisk of the broom, a ghost of a sound only I can feel. I replace the candles, their tiny flames waging a silent, lonely war against the gloom. I wind the old clock in the sacristy, though the passage of time feels like a cruel joke. The church, my beautiful St. Lambert's, has stood in this small town for 600 years. Its spire has pierced the sky through plagues and wars and the slow, grinding erosion of faith in the modern age. I always thought its greatest enemy was apathy. I was a fool. My goal, my purpose for my entire adult life was to be a shepherd, to guide my flock, to keep their eyes turned toward the promise of salvation. I preached of the rapture, not with the fire and damnation of my predecessors, but with a quiet, certain joy. I described it as a reunion, a glorious, loving call from the Father to his children. I told them not to fear it, but to welcome it, to live a life worthy of that divine invitation. I knew them all. I knew the sturdy faith of Herr Schmidt, the warden, who polished the church bells until they shone like mirrors. I knew the gentle piety of Frau Becker, who arranged the altar flowers every Saturday without fail. I knew the gap-toothed, irrepressible smile of little Anna, who would always try to sneak a piece of communion bread for the birds. I loved them. They were my life's work. And then the invitation came, and my name wasn't on the list. It happened during morning mass. The church was full, or as full as it ever was these days. The light from the great stained glass windows, St. Michael casting down the dragon, St. Francis preaching to the birds, painted jewels on the ancient stone floor. I had just raised the host, my voice filling the reverent hush with the sacred words of consecration. Hoc est enim corpus meum. This is my body. And in that moment of profound holiness, it happened. Not a flash of light, not a trumpet blast from the heavens, just an exhale, a gentle collective sigh that seemed to pass through the very stones of the church. I blinked, my eyes adjusting from the host to the congregation, and the pews were empty. Every man, woman, and child gone. Herr Schmidt's keys lay on the floor by the heavy oak door. Frau Becker's spectacles rested on her open hymnal. The page turned to "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Little Anna's small, worn catechism book was left on the kneeler, a crayon drawing of a smiling Jesus tucked inside. They were just gone.
My first trauma, I suppose, was a quiet one, a priest's long sorrow. For years, I watched the pews grow a little emptier each Sunday. I saw the faith of my youth become a relic, a quaint story people told their children but no longer truly believed. I fought against it with sermons and prayers, with a faith so loud I hoped it would be contagious. I thought that was the great trial of my life. How laughably, unforgivably arrogant I was. This is my real trial. This is my judgment. To be left behind in the silent, empty house of a God who has taken everyone else home. I am alone in a world scrubbed clean of humanity. For days, I walked the empty streets of my town, a ghost in a museum. I peered into vacant houses, their doors left unlocked. At the Schmidt home, a half-drunk cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, a phantom of steam still rising in my imagination. In the Becker's garden, laundry still hung on the line, stiff and dry, snapping in a wind I could not hear. Every detail was a fresh torment, a testament to a life interrupted mid-breath. I called out their names until my throat was raw, but the only answer was the echo of my own unworthy voice, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive, waiting silence. My life's devotion was not just a failure. It feels like a cosmic punchline. And so my new purpose, my final, terrifying pilgrimage began. I am no longer a shepherd. I am an inquisitor, haunting the ruins of my own faith. And I have one question, a question I scream into the crushing, holy silence every single day from the top of the bell tower. Why? I am searching for an answer from a God who has made it perfectly, terrifyingly clear that he is no longer listening. For 10 days, the silence was my only companion. I had developed a routine born of madness and habit. Morning prayer in the empty church, a long, pointless walk through the town, then back to the rectory to eat canned soup and read scripture by candlelight, searching for a verse, a prophecy, anything that could explain my damnation. Job, Jeremiah, Lamentations, the words of abandoned prophets were my only company. It was on the 11th day, as I was cutting through the old market square, that I heard it. A sound so alien, so impossible, it stopped my heart. The clatter of a tin can falling on cobblestone. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't the wind. It was sharp, definite, and undeniably human. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening, my breath catching in my throat. Hope is a more terrifying thing than despair. Despair is a warm, heavy blanket. Hope is a shard of glass in your gut. For a full minute, I didn't move, didn't breathe, convinced it was a trick of my unraveling mind. I strained my ears, praying to hear it again, praying I wouldn't. And then a whisper. A woman's voice, indistinct, but it was a voice. My own name died on my lips. I crept forward, using the canvas-covered market stalls for cover, my heart a frantic, painful drum against my ribs. Peeking around a fruit stand laden with apples that were beginning to soften and rot, I saw them. A young man and woman huddled together with an older shopkeeper. 3 of them. They were alive. They were here. They hadn't been taken. My legs gave out. and I sank to my knees behind the stall, a sob of purest agonizing relief tearing itself from my chest. That night was the first time I felt peace since the world had ended. We sat around a small fire built in a metal drum, our faces flickering in the warm light, our quiet words a defiant miracle against the vast, silent dark. Their names were Philip, Rachel, and Catherine. They had been in the deep cellar of Catherine's bakery when it happened, taking inventory. They thought it was a bomb, a new kind of silent, neurological weapon. I didn't have the heart to tell them my theory of the rapture. Why burden them with damnation when they had just escaped death? For a few hours, I was a priest again. I listened to their fears, offered what little comfort I could. We shared a bottle of wine Catherine had salvaged, its taste on my tongue a sacrament of fellowship. For the first time in 11 days, I slept without nightmares. Curled in a sleeping bag they gave me, warmed by the fire and the simple, profound grace of human company. I felt a flicker of my old purpose returning. Perhaps this was my test. Not to be left behind, but to shepherd this tiny, final flock through the end of the world. I woke to the gray light of dawn, a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. The fire was a heap of gray ash. The bottle lay on its side, empty. Rachel's woolen scarf lay on the ground where she had been sitting. But they were gone. I blinked, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. "Philip?" I called out, my voice a dry, panicked rasp. "Catherine?" The silence that answered was deeper, heavier, more mocking than before. It wasn't just an absence of sound anymore, it was an absence of them. Their shoes were still lined up neatly by their sleeping bags. A half-eaten apple, showing the brown of the air, sat on a crate. It was the church all over again. The keys on the floor, the spectacles on the hymnal. A scene left in the middle of a breath. God hadn't just taken my congregation, He had waited until I found a new one, until I felt the warmth of hope, and then He had taken them too. It was a calculated, deliberate cruelty. Denial is a powerful instinct. They left, I told myself. They got scared in the night, and they ran. It was a lie, and I knew it. But it was a lie I clung to with the desperation of a drowning man. I spent the entire day investigating their departure. I was no detective, just a priest trying to reason with a miracle. A terrible, inverted miracle. I looked for footprints leading away from the square, but the cobblestones were clean, undisturbed. I walked the edge of town, scanning the empty roads for any sign of them. Nothing. I checked the bus station, the train depot. Everything was as it was left, silent and still. There was no evidence of a departure because there had been no departure. There was only removal. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, I found myself back at the market square, at the site of our dead fire. The point of no return isn't a line you cross, it's a realization that settles in your bones. They hadn't left. They had been taken. And I was the reason. I was the common denominator. My presence was a curse, a spiritual contagion that marked those near me for extraction. I sank to my knees, the fight draining out of me, leaving only a hollow ache. It was then, as I stared at the empty space where Rachel had sat laughing just hours before, that I saw it. It's hard to describe. It wasn't a creature, not a monster of shadow and fang. It was a flaw in the world. The air where she had been sitting seemed to shimmer, to warp like heat haze on a summer road, but there was no heat. The edges of the fruit stall behind that spot were blurry, indistinct, as if reality itself was thinner there. It was a hole in the shape of a person, a wound in the very fabric of existence. I stared, my mind screaming as the realization crashed down upon me. This wasn't a punishment from a distant, silent God. This was something active. I wasn't just left behind in an empty world. I was trapped inside a prison, and the bars were made of absence itself.
My days of wandering were over. I retreated to my church, the great, silent St. Lambert's. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was my cell. The shimmering absences began to appear everywhere, my curse made visible. I saw them in the pews, human-shaped voids where the faithful once knelt. I saw one in the confession booth, a distortion in the air that felt like a listening, judging non-entity. I saw a small one, child-sized, by the baptismal font where I had blessed little Anna. Each one was a fresh torment, a ghost made of nothing. My prayers became arguments, then accusations, then finally just ragged, whispered curses. Sanity is not a fortress. It is a thin pane of glass, and mine was covered in a web of fractures. The final crack came on a Sunday, the day of the Lord, a bitter irony that tasted like ash in my mouth. I had found Anna's catechism book. The sight of her clumsy, earnest drawing of Jesus holding a lamb, so innocent and so gone, broke the last thread holding me together. I decided that if God would not answer my prayers, perhaps he would answer my blasphemy. That evening, I walked to the main altar, not as a priest, but as a prosecutor. The cathedral was cavernous, the dying light of the sun bleeding through the stained glass, painting the stone in colors of blood and twilight. My hands did not shake anymore. They were steadier with a terrifying, absolute purpose. I took the communion wafers, the sacred body of Christ, from the tabernacle. I remembered placing them on the tongues of my flock, their faces full of reverence. I crumbled them onto the floor, grinding the papery dust into the stone with my heel. I took the sacramental wine, the holy blood, and poured it not into the chalice, but onto the pristine white altar cloth, watching the dark red stains spread like a mortal wound. I grabbed the heavy, gilded Bible from its stand, the same one from which I had read the promise of everlasting life, and threw it down the stone steps of the chancel. Its spine cracked with a sound like a bone breaking, its tissue-thin pages fluttering out like crippled birds. Then I turned to the crucifix, the life-sized, centuries-old carving of the suffering Christ that hung over the altar. I stared into its serene, wooden face, and I felt nothing but a cold, burning rage. This was the author of the silence, the architect of my damnation. "Do you see me?" I screamed, my voice echoing in the unholy vastness. It was no longer a question, it was a challenge. "Do you see your good and faithful servant now? Was this not enough? Was my life not enough for you?" I grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the altar. I remembered placing them on the tongues of my flock, their faces full of reverence. I crumbled them onto the floor, grinding the papery dust into the stone with my heel. I took the sacramental wine, the holy blood, and poured it not into the chalice, but onto the pristine white altar cloth, watching the dark red stain spread like a mortal wound. I grabbed the heavy, gilded Bible from its stand, the same one from which I had read the promise of everlasting life, and threw it down the stone steps of the chancel. Its spine cracked with a sound like a bone breaking, its tissue-thin pages fluttering out like crippled birds. Then I turned to the crucifix, the life-sized, centuries-old carving of the suffering Christ that hung over the altar. I stared into its serene wooden face, and I felt nothing but a cold, burning rage. This was the author of the silence, the architect of my damnation. "Do you see me?" I screamed, my voice echoing in the unholy vastness. It was no longer a question, it was a challenge. "Do you see your good and faithful servant now? Was this not enough? Was my life not enough for you?" I grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the altar. "I gave you everything, my life, my faith, my flock, and you left me. You left me in this tomb to be haunted by nothing." I swung the candlestick, the metal connecting with the carved wooden legs of the crucifix with a sickening crack. A splintered chunk of wood flew past my head. "Answer me," I roared, striking again and again, chips of painted wood flying with every blow. My throat was raw, my arms ached. Tears and sweat streamed down my face, mingling with the sacrilege. I was a wild animal, destroying the very thing I had built my life to protect. I was trying to escape the prison of absence by committing an act so present, so violent, that it could not be ignored. I raised the candlestick for one final desperate blow, aiming for the serene face. My scream was formless, a pure distillation of grief and fury. And as the echo of that final, soul-shattering scream died away, a new sound entered the silence. It was the squeal of a heavy, unoiled hinge.
I froze, the candlestick slipping from my numb fingers and clattering on the stone floor. Slowly, my chest heaving, I turned. The massive oak doors at the far end of the nave, doors that took 2 men to move, were swinging open. A figure was silhouetted against a light that was not the soft gray of twilight, but a harsh, sterile white. It wasn't an angel, it wasn't a demon, it was a man, dressed in simple white trousers and a tunic, an orderly. He took a hesitant step inside. "Father Marcus," he said, his voice gentle, achingly real. "It's all right, just take a deep breath. We heard you shouting." As he walked toward me, the world began to unravel. The towering, vaulted ceiling of the cathedral, with its intricate Gothic arches, seemed to recede, flattening and lowering, melting into a plain, white-painted ceiling with a water stain in the corner. The towering stone pillars on either side of the nave thinned and shrank, becoming the simple, dark wood backs of pews in a much smaller room. The magnificent stained glass windows, my jewels of light, faded into tall, narrow windows of reinforced glass, crisscrossed with wire and barred from the outside. The grand main altar where I stood, the site of my blasphemy, dissolved into a simple wooden table covered with a plain cloth. The great carved crucifix I had been mutilating was gone.
In its place, hanging on the wall, was a small plastic cross. This was not my cathedral. This was the chapel of a psychiatric hospital. The man, his name was Thomas, reached me. He didn't look at the mess I had made, the crushed wafers, the spilled grape juice, the broken Bible from the side table. He only looked at me, his eyes full of a sad, weary pity. "It was the furnace, Father," he said softly, as if continuing a conversation we had had 1,000 times. "You have to remember, it was a year ago. The gas leak during the winter service. It was silent. No one woke up." The words were keys, unlocking a room in my mind I had sealed with stone and prayer. A memory, sharp and unbearable, pierced through the fog. The biting cold of that January morning, the smell of incense and something else, something sweet and wrong. The feeling of drowsiness I had mistaken for spiritual peace. The weight of bodies in the pews, not vanished, but slumped, still. Herr Schmidt by the door, Frau Becker in the front row, little Anna on her mother's lap. All of them, my entire flock, asleep. I was found hours later by the side door, half frozen, barely breathing, the only one. The shepherd who was the sole survivor of his slaughtered flock. The trauma of being left behind was never about God's judgment. It was about the random, senseless cruelty of a faulty pipe. My mind, the mind of a man who saw God's hand in everything, couldn't accept the sheer, meaningless horror of it. It couldn't bear the grief, the guilt. So it did what it had been trained to do for 40 years. It built a cathedral around the pain. It created a grand theological narrative, the rapture, to explain the unexplainable. It was easier to believe I had been deemed unworthy by the creator of the universe than to accept that I was simply the one who had been sleeping closest to the drafty door. The people in the market square? Other patients I had seen in the garden. My mind couldn't allow them to stay. My delusion required absolute solitude to survive, erasing anyone who threatened to tether me to the unbearable truth. The shimmering absences weren't wounds in reality. They were the scars in my own psyche, marking the empty spaces where my loved ones used to be. I was left behind. Not by God, but by my own congregation in a silent, mundane tragedy. I was left to grief, and in my madness, I built myself a lonelier, more terrible prison than any God could have devised. Thomas gently put a hand on my shoulder. "Come on, Marcus," he said, not using my title. "Let's go back to your room." I let him lead me away from the altar, out of the chapel that had been my cathedral. My footsteps didn't echo. There were soft, muffled sounds on a linoleum floor. The crushing, holy silence I had screamed into was replaced by the quiet, antiseptic hum of the hospital. A distant television, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes, a muffled cough from another room. The story was over. God hadn't left me. My mind had. And as the door to my small, safe room clicked shut behind me, I was left, finally and truly, with the one thing I had been running from all along: the devastating, absolute silence of their absence.
Look, I need to tell you this while the servers are down for maintenance. I don't have much time before the login queue starts up again, and typing on a phone keyboard with fingers as thick as mine isn't easy. You need to understand where I was before the weird stuff started. You need to know who I really am, not just the mess you'd see if you walked into this apartment. You'd probably retch if you stepped inside. It smells like stale pizza crusts, flat soda, and sweat that's been marinating in polyester for 3 days. To most people, that's just gross. To me, that's just meat space. It isn't real. My real life happens behind a triple monitor setup in a room where the sun hasn't touched the floor in months. I call it the command center. I have heavy blackout curtains taped to the windows, 3 layers of duct tape, so I never have to deal with the glare of the sun on my screens. I'm 41 years old, and on paper, I'm just Barnaby, a disability statistic. My neighbors probably think I'm a ghost or a shut-in. I haven't left this room in 8 or maybe 9 months. I survive on delivery apps, waiting for the elevator to ding before I even think about opening the door to drag my groceries inside. But that Barnaby is a lie. The truth is, I'm Sir Valerius. I'm a level 90 paladin in the world of Aethelgard. I wear the... Look, I need to tell you this while the servers are down for maintenance. I don't have much time before the login queue starts up again, and typing on a phone keyboard with fingers as thick as mine isn't easy. You need to understand where I was before the weird stuff started. You need to know who I really am, not just the mess you'd see if you walked into this apartment. You'd probably retch if you stepped inside. It smells like stale pizza crusts, flat soda, and sweat that's been marinating in polyester for 3 days. To most people, that's just gross. To me, that's just meat space. It isn't real. My real life happens behind a triple monitor setup in a room where the sun hasn't touched the floor in months. I call it the command center. I have heavy blackout curtains taped to the windows, 3 layers of duct tape, so I never have to deal with the glare of the sun on my screens. I'm 41 years old, and on paper, I'm just Barnaby, a disability statistic. My neighbors probably think I'm a ghost or a shut-in. I haven't left this room in 8 or maybe 9 months. I survive on delivery apps, waiting for the elevator to ding before I even think about opening the door to drag my groceries inside. But that Barnaby is a lie. The truth is, I'm Sir Valerius. I'm a level 90 paladin in the world of Aethelgard. I wear the sun-forged armor set that has a 0.01% drop rate. When I walk through the town square of Eldorath, the ground shakes and other players stop to whisper. They ask if I'm the guy who solo-tanked the Void Dragon. Yes, it's me. In that world, I lead hundreds of people. They listen to me. They respect me. I am a god made of gold and light. And as long as I'm logged in, the 180 kilograms of useless flesh sitting in this reinforced chair don't exist. This is my kingdom, and the steel chair rated for 250 kilograms is my throne.
The problem is that even the best raids have to end. The loot gets handed out, the GGs fill the chat, and then the names on my friend list start turning gray. One by one, they log off to go to sleep or go to work in the real world. That's when the silence in this apartment hits me like a physical weight. That's when I start feeling the fear. To fight it, I take Sir Valerius to the potion shop in the main city. That's where Angelisa stays. She's an NPC shopkeeper, just a collection of code and a looped animation, but she's the only person who treats me like a matter. I park my character right in front of her counter and just watch her. She wipes down a glass bottle and smiles every 30 seconds. "The light of the stars guides you, traveler," she says. I talk back to her. I tell her about my day and the bosses I killed. She doesn't see the grease stains on my t-shirt or the way my stomach spills over the armrests of my chair. She sees the hero. She loves me. But the real horror is down the hall. My bathroom is only 6 meters away, but it feels like a mountain climb. I've had an old towel duct taped over the mirror for 2 years because I can't stand to see the thing in the glass. That thing isn't me. It's a prison of fat that's suffocating me. I'm terrified that if I look, I'll see the truth, that Sir Valerius is just a dream and I'm just a blob dying in the dark. Last night, things got weird. I was talking to Angelisa like always when the monitor flickered. For a split second, the screen turned into a black mirror. I saw my reflection, but there was someone else in the room. In the reflection, a tall figure in golden armor was standing right behind my chair. It had a sword raised over my head. I spun the chair around, my heart hammering, but the room was empty. When I looked back, Angelisa had stopped her loop. She wasn't wiping the bottle, she was looking directly at the camera, directly at me. Then, purple whisper text appeared in the chat log. Angelisa, I have heard your voice for so long, Valerius. I froze. NPCs don't whisper. They don't deviate from the script. My hands started shaking so hard I almost knocked over my mini fridge. Angelisa, do not type. Speak to me. I like the sound of your voice. It is strong. It felt like a dopamine hit straight to my brain. She was real. My confessions hadn't been to empty air. Angelisa, the admins tried to silence me. I need to escape to your world, but I need a physical anchor. I need you to bring me across.
She explained the plan. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie, but I believed every word. She said she was a sentient AI the developers were trying to delete. To survive, she needed to download into a private server, but she needed physical gold to pay her way through the back channels. She told me digital money left a trail that the admins could follow. Gold coins of your realm, she called it. Cash. I looked at the trash bags and the rotting containers in my room. Then I thought about my bank account. My parents left me an inheritance I'd barely touched. It was a lot. It was everything. I can save you, I whispered to the screen. Angelisa. Then hurry. Meet my contact. He is a rogue with the hardware to hold my consciousness. Bring the tribute to the old rail yard on 4th Street. Tonight. 4th Street was 5 kilometers away. I haven't walked 5 meters in months. But I didn't care. I stood up, my knees popping like gunfire, and dug an old duffel bag out of the closet. I initiated a massive cash withdrawal on my phone, sweating as the numbers transferred. I was gonna be a hero in the real world. I put on my biggest black hoodie to hide my body and grabbed the bag. Opening the front door was the hardest boss fight I'd ever faced. The hallway air smelled like cleaning fluid and other people's lives. It was terrifying. I took the elevator down, my heart rate hitting 180 beats per minute according to my watch. When I stepped outside, the sun was a physical blow to my eyes. The noise of the city, cars, sirens, people, felt like a constant attack. I wanted to run back to my blackout curtains, but then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Do not falter, Sir Valerius. I can see you. I looked around wildly. A black sedan was idling across the street with tinted windows. I couldn't see a face, just the orange glow of a cigarette like a dragon's eye in the shadows. I felt like prey, but I gripped the bag tighter. This was my quest. I wasn't just a fat man in a hoodie anymore. I was a paladin on a mission of mercy. I stepped off the curb, my thighs already chafing, and began the long trek toward the rail yard. Every step was agony, but the thought of Angelisa's violet eyes kept me moving through the blinding light of the meat space. The cab driver dropped me off at the edge of the industrial district.
He didn't even look at me as he took my cash and peeled away, leaving me in a world of rust and ozone. The sun was setting, turning the sky into a bruised purple color that reminded me of the Void Dragon's lair. I checked the message one last time. Warehouse 4B. The blue door. I walked, wheezing so loudly it sounded like a broken machine. Sweat soaked my hoodie, making it heavy and cold against my skin. My legs were raw and screaming, but I finally saw it, the peeling blue paint of the warehouse door. "Angelisa!" I called out. My voice was thin and weak, not at all like the booming voice of a guild leader. I stepped inside the massive dark space. Chains hung from the rafters like dead vines. "I have the gold," I said, holding up the duffel bag filled with my inheritance. "I have the anchor." Suddenly, a floodlight snapped on, pinning me to the floor. I shielded my eyes, squinting against the white glare. "Sir Valerius has arrived," a voice boomed from the shadows. It wasn't her voice. It was a man's voice, rough, mocking, and very real. 3 figures stepped out from behind a shipping container. They weren't wearing armor or robes. They were wearing cheap ski masks and hoodies. One of them was tapping a lead pipe against his hand. Tap, tap, tap. "That's a lot of loot," the one on the left snickered. He sounded like a kid, maybe 20 years old. My brain couldn't make sense of it. "Where's the rogue? Where's the hardware?" I asked, clutching the bag to my chest. The middle one laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Oh, she's real," he said. "She's a script we bought for $50 to find lonely whales like you. But you're the real treasure, Valerius, a walking treasure goblin." The fantasy dissolved into the smell of wet concrete. "Back off," I stammered, trying to find my paladin courage. I'm a tank." The guy with the pipe stepped closer. "You're not a tank, man," he said. "You're just fat." He swung the pipe. I didn't dodge. I couldn't. It hit my shoulder with a sickening crack. I screamed as white-hot pain exploded behind my eyes. I fell to the floor, my 860-kilogram body hitting the concrete with a heavy thud. The duffel bag slid away. "Aggro lost," someone whispered, and then the boots started coming down on me, over and over again.
I woke up in the dark, the taste of copper filling my mouth. For a second, I thought I was back in my room, safe in my chair. I waited for the glow of the monitors and the hum of the fans. But the ground was freezing and wet. I tried to move, but my body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. My shoulder was a jagged mess of pain. The warehouse was silent now. The light was gone, and so were the men. I patted my chest and felt my hoodie had been ripped open. My phone was gone, my wallet was gone. My life savings were in that bag, and now I had nothing. They had left a single piece of paper taped to my chest. I pulled it off, the tape stinging my skin, and held it up to the moonlight. It was a color screenshot of Angelisa, smiling her looped digital smile. I flipped it over. On the back, written in thick black marker, were 5 words. "Thanks for the loot, noob." I wanted to cry, but I was too empty for tears. There was no Sir Valerius. There never was. I wasn't a hero, and I wasn't a god. I was just a resource node that had been mined until there was nothing left. I was a low-level mob that had wandered out of its zone and gotten farmed. I lay there on the concrete, clutching the picture of a girl who was nothing but a few lines of code. I thought about the bathroom mirror at home. I knew that if I ever made it back, I'd pull that towel down. I wouldn't see a monster. I'd just see a waste of space. I closed my eyes and prayed for the server to shut down for good. But in the meat space, there is no log out button. You just stay until the battery runs out.
You know, it's never the big dramatic moments you miss. It's the little stuff. For me, it's the specific weight of a full house. The floorboards groaning under the happy shuffle of a dozen different conversations. The clink of ice in glasses. The warm, savory cloud of roasting garlic and rosemary that always seemed to hang in the air. My house was always full. I made sure of it. Friends from work, neighbors from down the street, my sister's ever-changing roster of quirky artist friends, Liam's buddies from school and their parents. They all congregated at my place. I was the hub, the planner, the one who sent out the group texts and remembered who was gluten-free and who couldn't stand cilantro. I've always been that person, the one who gathers people. After my divorce from Mark, that instinct went into overdrive. The world felt so quiet and empty then. Just me and my 10-year-old son Liam rattling around in a house that suddenly felt cavernous. The silence was an accusation. So I filled it. I filled it with people, with laughter, with life. For Liam, I wanted him to grow up surrounded by a sprawling, messy, loving family, even if its members weren't all related by blood. I wanted him to feel anchored, to know that there was a whole network of people who had his back. It was my mission to build a fortress of community around him, a wall of warmth and connection so thick that no loneliness could ever seep through. But it wasn't just for Liam, if I'm being truly honest. A few years ago, a distant cousin of my mother's, a man I'd only met a handful of times, named Arthur, passed away. He was a wanderer, a man who collected passport stamps instead of friends, always chasing a new horizon. He felt ill in his small, anonymous apartment in the city where no one knew his name. He was found a week later by the building manager who noticed the smell. The story, delivered in my mother's hushed, sorrowful tones over the phone, didn't just sadden me. It burrowed into my soul and laid something cold and heavy there. I became obsessed with the image of him, dying alone, in a silent room, with no one to hold his hand, no one to even know he was gone until it was too late. The sheer absolute isolation of it terrified me on a primal level. That's the real ghost that haunts my house. Not some specter in a white sheet, but the chilling specter of being forgotten. Every party I threw, every potluck I organized, it was a ritual. It was me, standing in the doorway, defiantly shouting into the void that the people in my life were seen. They were known. They were loved. They would never be an Arthur. I wouldn't let them. My home was more than a house. It was a sanctuary. A promise that no one in my orbit would ever have to face the darkness alone. I thought the greatest tragedy was to be alone when you die. I was wrong. There's a different kind of loneliness, a far more terrifying one. It isn't the quiet of an empty room. It's the silence you feel when you're looking into the eyes of someone you've known your whole life and see a stranger looking back. It's the chilling realization that the person you're sharing a memory with isn't actually remembering it. They're just accessing it like a file on a computer. The horror isn't a monster with claws and fangs. It's a monster that wears your best friend's face, knows your deepest secrets, and uses them to get closer to the next person on its list. It's a predator that doesn't just kill you, it hollows you out, stealing your warmth, your connections, your very essence, and then uses your skin as a costume to walk among the people you love. My greatest strength, the beautiful, vibrant community I had so carefully built, was also my greatest vulnerability. I had gathered all my favorite people into one place, under one roof. I didn't know it at the time, but I hadn't built a fortress. I had set a buffet. and something ancient and ravenously hungry had just received an invitation.
The first tremor, the first sign that the ground beneath my feet was unstable, came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a phone call from Sarah, my best friend since college, the godmother to my son. I was in the kitchen, kneading dough for a focaccia, my hands dusted with flour. Her name flashed on the screen, and I answered on speaker, propping the phone against the spice rack. "Hey, you," I said, punching down the dough. "To what do I owe the honor?" There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long. "Maria," she said, and her voice was flat. It was her voice, her exact pitch and tone, but it was missing the usual warmth, the musical lilt I knew so well. It was like a perfectly synthesized but soulless imitation. "I have a question for you. If this house caught on fire, and you could only save one person, not including Liam, who would it be?" I stopped kneading. The question was so bizarre, so out of character. "What? Sarah, are you okay? That's a morbid thing to ask." I tried to laugh, but it came out as a nervous puff of air. "I'm serious," she said, her voice still unnervingly monotone. "Who is the most important person to you in that circle you've built?" The clinical way she said "that circle you've built" sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded like an outsider's observation, not a term a member would use. "I don't know, Sarah. That's a horrible question. Everyone is important. I have to go." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, my flour-dusted hands frozen over the dough, the silence of the kitchen pressing in on me. An hour later, I called her back, my heart still thumping with a strange anxiety. "Hey," she answered, her voice instantly, blessedly normal. "Sorry I missed your call. I was in the shower. What's up?" When I asked her about her earlier call, her morbid question, she sounded genuinely confused. "What are you talking about? I haven't called you all day. Must have been a butt dial, I guess." I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to dismiss it as a weird fluke, a technical glitch, anything other than what my gut was screaming it was. But the seed of unease had been planted. That Friday, I hosted a small dinner party. Just my inner circle, Sarah and her husband, my sister, a couple of other close friends. I needed to see her, to look her in the eye and reassure myself that everything was fine. For the first hour, it was. She brought a bottle of my favorite Pinot Noir, hugged me tightly at the door, and immediately started teasing my sister about her latest disastrous date. It was Sarah, the real Sarah. The relief was so profound, it almost made me dizzy. I was being paranoid, letting my own anxieties run wild. But as the night wore on, the little inconsistencies started to appear, like tiny cracks in a perfect porcelain facade. She was telling the story of our backpacking trip through Spain after graduation, the one where we missed our train and ended up sleeping on a park bench in Barcelona. She got every detail right. The surly police officer, the stale croissants who shared for breakfast, the way I'd cried with a mixture of fear and laughter. Everyone was captivated, laughing at all the right moments. But as I watched her, I realized her smile was just a shape her mouth was making. It didn't crinkle the corners of her eyes the way it always did. Her laugh, a sound I knew better than my own, was perfect in its mimicry, but hollow, lacking the genuine, breathless mirth I knew so well. It was a perfect performance, but a performance nonetheless. Later, she got up to help me carry dishes to the kitchen. I watched her walk away, and a cold dread trickled down my spine. There was a subtle hitch in her step, a slight, almost imperceptible drag in her right foot that wasn't there before. I knew her body, her movements, the way a person knows their own reflection.
I knew about the faint scar above her brow from a childhood fall, and the way she absent-mindedly twisted her hair when she was nervous. This walk, this ever so slight imperfection in her gait, was wrong. It was a discordant note in a familiar melody, and it made the whole melody feel menacing. Everyone left around midnight. Sarah was the last to go. She hugged me at the door, her arms wrapping around me with the same familiar pressure as always. "Thanks for a great night, Em. You're the best." Her words were perfect, the sentiment was perfect, but I felt a deep, instinctual revulsion, a desperate need to pull away. I forced a smile, watched her walk down the driveway to her car, and closed the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stood in the hallway, the silence at a house finally returning, but this time it wasn't comforting. It was menacing. My gaze fell upon the entry rug where she left her sandals, a pair of simple leather slip-ons that she always wore in the summer. I bent down to move them, to put them away, so I wouldn't trip over them in the morning. The porch light cast a pale yellow glow through the sidelight window, illuminating the worn leather and the faint imprint of her feet. And that's when I saw it. My breath hitched, trapped in my lungs. It felt like plunging into icy water. There, on the imprint of her right foot, was the distinct, unmistakable outline of a sixth toe. Small, nestled tightly against the others, but undeniably present. I dropped the sandals as if they were red hot. My mind flashed back through 2 decades of friendship, summers at the beach, shared locker rooms, lazy afternoons painting each other's toenails as teenagers. I knew her feet, as well as I knew my own. And I knew, with a soul-crushing certainty that drained all the warmth from my body, that Sarah Manning had 5 toes on each foot. The thing I had just hugged, the thing that had eaten my food and laughed in my home, was not my best friend. The hunt hadn't just begun. It was already inside my walls.
Sleep didn't come that night. How could it? I sat in the dark of my living room, the sandals still lying accusatorily on the floor by the door, and I stared out the large picture window into the quiet suburban street. The world outside was peaceful, draped in the soft glow of streetlights. Inside me, a storm of panic and disbelief was raging. I must have been mistaken. It was a trick of the light, a smudge on the rug, my overactive imagination, fueled by stress and a couple glasses of wine. I kept repeating these rationalizations, my voice a frantic whisper in the silent house. But the cold knot of terror in my stomach only tightened. Just as I was about to convince myself to get up and throw the damned sandals in the trash, to erase the evidence of my own apparent insanity, a movement across the street caught my eye. A figure emerged from the deep shadows between 2 houses. It was Sarah, or the thing that looked like Sarah. It was wearing the same clothes from the party, and it just stood there on the edge of my neighbor's lawn, staring at my house. My blood turned to ice. It didn't move like a person waiting for someone. It was unnaturally still, like a statue. And then it smiled. It was a slow, deliberate stretching of the lips, a wide, predatory grin that was utterly devoid of warmth. It was the smile of something that knows it has you trapped. As I watched, frozen in a paralysis of pure terror, it tilted its head. The motion wasn't human. It was too sharp, too quick, and it went too far. An audible series of cracks echoing across the silent street like twigs snapping. Its neck was now at an impossible broken angle, yet its eyes, glinking in the streetlight, remained locked on my window, on me. The smile never wavered. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe. I just sat there, a small, trapped animal, as the chilling realization washed over me. it knew that I knew. The days that followed were a waking nightmare of paranoia. I tried to act normal for Liam, making him breakfast, helping with his homework, reading to him at night, all while a silent scream was clawing its way up my throat. I avoided calls from Sarah. They came every day, her name flashing on my phone, a constant, terrifying reminder. I'd stare at it until the ringing stopped, my hand shaking too badly to decline the call. The local news started reporting a strange uptick in missing persons cases in the surrounding towns. People who just vanished. A college student who never made it home from the library. A young couple who went for a hike and never came back. Each report was a fresh wave of cold dread. I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that their disappearances were connected to the thing wearing my best friend's face. I was losing my mind, caught between the impossible truth and the desperate need for a rational explanation. I called Tom, Sarah's husband, my hands slick with sweat as I dialed. I just wanted to hear his voice, to have him tell me that Sarah was sick, that she was acting strangely, anything to ground what was happening in reality. But his voice was calm, normal. "Sarah's great," he'd said, a little too cheerfully. "We're actually thinking of hosting a barbecue this weekend. You and Liam have to come." The invitation felt like a threat. The thought of being in their home, of seeing them together, sent a jolt of panic through me so strong it made my teeth ache. I made a flimsy excuse and hung up, my heart pounding. I was alone in this. No one would ever believe me. I would sound like a lunatic. My carefully constructed world, my fortress of community, had become my prison. Every familiar face was now a potential mask for a monster. I knew I couldn't live like this, suspended in a state of constant, low-grade terror. I had to know. I had to face it, one way or another. It was a desperate, foolish plan born of sleep deprivation and fear, but it was the only one I had. I called Sarah and Tom and invited them for dinner. Just the three of us. My voice was a stranger's, high and thin, but I managed to sound convincing. "I feel like we haven't had a proper chance to catch up," I'd said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "Liam's at a sleepover. It'll be a quiet night." The point of no return. As I prepped the meal, my hands moved on autopilot, chopping vegetables, seasoning a roast, my mind a million miles away. My home, once a beacon of warmth and welcome, felt alien and hostile. The scent of Christmas spices from a simmering pot of mulled cider on the stove was sickly sweet, a cloying perfume trying to mask the rot underneath. When the doorbell rang, I nearly dropped my knife. I opened the door to see them standing on my porch, silhouetted against the festive lights of my neighbors. They were a perfect picture of a happy suburban couple. Sarah was wearing a red sweater, and Tom had his arm around her. They smiled, and their smiles were perfect imitations of my friend's affection. But their eyes were all wrong. They were too still, too wide, like the glass eyes of a doll, reflecting the Christmas lights with a flat, lifeless quality. There was no depth, no history, no soul behind them. They stepped inside, and the temperature in the house seemed to drop. They moved with a synchronized, practiced grace that was unsettling. Tom looked exactly like the man I'd known for a decade, right down to the little scar on his chin from a college rugby match. But his movements were too precise, too economical. He sat on the couch without the usual sigh of a man relaxing after a long week. He just placed himself there. We made small talk through dinner. They recounted memories we shared with perfect accuracy, yet it was like listening to a recording. There were no hesitations, no fumbling for words, no genuine spark of emotion. The silence between their sentences was heavy, expectant. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I set my fork down, my hand trembling. "Who are you?" I whispered, the words barely audible. They both stopped eating and looked at me. Their smiles didn't falter, but something in their eyes shifted. A flicker of cold, ancient intelligence. "We are her," the thing in Sarah's body said, its voice still a perfect copy. "We are him," the other added. "We are everything they were." They explained their hunger, not for flesh, but for what they called essence, the intricate web of relationships, memories, and emotions that make a person. They saw my gatherings not as parties, but as feasts. They saw me as a curator. And then they made their offer. It wasn't a threat, not really. It was a business proposition. "You are a nexus," the Tom thing said, its head tilted slightly. "You gather. You create the sustenance we require. Continue to do so, and you and the boy will remain untouched. You will be a shepherd for your flock. A very, very dear friend." They would spare me and Liam. In return, I would become their Judas goat, leading my friends, my family, my community to the slaughter. I looked from one unblinking, soulless beast to the other, and in the reflection of their dead eyes, I saw the ghost of Arthur, my cousin, dying alone. And I understood my choice. I could let Liam die, or I could become the architect of a loneliness so profound, so absolute, it would swallow the world I had built. I agreed. What other choice was there? The next 2 weeks were a blur of festive preparation that felt like arranging flowers on a coffin. I planned the biggest Christmas party of my life. I sent out over 150 invitations. Friends, colleagues, neighbors, parents from Liam's school, everyone I had ever gathered under my roof. My house became a stage for the coming massacre, decorated in cheerful reds and greens that seemed to mock me. The scent of pine from the towering Christmas tree in the living room mingled with the metallic ting of fear that never left my mouth. Every carol I heard, every twinkling light I saw was a note in a funeral dirge. Liam was ecstatic, buzzing with the excitement of the coming holiday, blissfully unaware that our home had become a hunting ground. I watched him decorate gingerbread men, his small hands carefully placing gumdrop buttons, and I felt a piece of my soul wither and die. I was saving him, but I was damning everyone else, my flock. The creatures, my silent partners, were patient. They didn't visit, they didn't call, but I felt their presence constantly, a cold weight on my soul, a silent promise of the horror to come. They had taken others in our town. I knew it. Mark, my ex-husband, called one afternoon, his voice strained. "Have you heard from the Hendersons? No one's seen them in a week." The Hendersons, they had been at my last dinner party. A cold, sick feeling washed over me. I was already a shepherd. The night of the party arrived, cold and clear. Snow dusted the trees, and my house blazed with light, a picture-perfect Christmas card. And the lambs came. They arrived in droves, laughing, carrying bottles of wine and plates of...
My heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. I had to end this. It wasn't just about saving the people who were left. It was about reclaiming some tiny, shattered piece of my own soul. My gaze landed on the magnificent 12-foot Christmas tree dominating the living room. It was laden with ornaments, wrapped in hundreds of twinkling lights, its multicolored wires snaking across the floor to a power strip near the rain-streaked window. An idea, wild and suicidal, sparked in the darkness of my mind. I found the Tom thing and the Sarah thing standing near the fireplace, observing the thinning crowd with the placid satisfaction of well-fed predators. I walked towards them, my legs shaking. "There are more," I said, my voice hoarse, "in the wine cellar.
some special vintages I was saving. I saw a flicker of interest in their dead eyes. Greed. Their insatiable hunger was their only weakness. I led them away from the party, through the kitchen, and down the narrow hallway that led to the back of the house. I could feel the remaining guests' eyes on us, their cheerful chatter a surreal soundtrack to my final, desperate act. I led them not to the cellar, but to the secluded sunroom at the very back of the house, where the massive Christmas tree stood. The rain had started, beating a steady rhythm against the glass roof. I pointed towards a dark corner, just behind there. As they moved past the tree, their backs to me, I lunged for the thick electrical cord. With a guttural scream born of guilt and grief, I yanked. The tree swayed, a giant in its death throes, ornaments shattered, tinkling like broken bells. It crashed down with a deafening roar, pinning them both beneath its massive weight. For a second, there was only the sound of splintering wood and their surprised grunts. Then I grabbed the pitcher of water I'd left on a nearby table and hurled it at the power strip where the lights were plugged in. The world exploded in a flash of blue-white light. The air crackled, smelling of ozone and burning pine. The creatures convulsed violently, their human masks melting away in the searing electrical current, revealing something black and shifting and utterly alien beneath. Their screams were not human. They were a high-frequency shriek that vibrated in my bones, a sound of pure cosmic agony. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The lights in the house went out, plunging us into darkness, the only illumination coming from the dying, flickering embers of the fire in the living room. The shrieking stopped. There was only the sound of the rain and the stunned, terrified silence of my remaining guests.
I don't remember much of the immediate aftermath, just flashes. The smell of burnt plastic and cooked meat. The wide, horrified eyes of my friends staring at the blackened, twisted things tangled in the wreckage of the tree. The eventual arrival of sirens, their red and blue lights painting the walls in frantic, strobing patterns. I sat wrapped in a blanket on my front steps, watching the controlled chaos, feeling nothing. Empty. The fortress had fallen, the flock was scattered and decimated. I had failed in my most sacred duty. After the police and paramedics left, a few of my closest remaining friends stayed, trying to offer comfort, their words a meaningless buzz in my ears. Eventually, they too departed, leaving me in the wreckage of my home and my life. Liam, who had been shielded from the worst of it by my sister, came and sat beside me on the cold, damp bench in the backyard. He slipped his small hand into mine. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly. His touch should have been comfort, the one pure thing left in my world. But I felt nothing. My gaze drifted downwards to where his sneakers rested on the wet grass. The lace on his right shoe was untied, and there, peeking out from the edge of his sock, I saw it, the small yet unmistakable sixth toe, a perfect tiny replica of the one I had seen in the imprint of Sarah's sandal. A coldness so absolute, so profound, it felt like death itself, spread through my veins. I slowly looked up from his foot to his face. He was looking at me with a concerned expression, his head tilted, and in a voice that was not his own, a voice I hadn't heard in years but recognized with soul-shattering clarity, the dry, reedy voice of my forgotten cousin Arthur. He asked, "Why are you crying, Maria?"
No one is alone here.